meeting of the Sebastopol, City of Sebastopol Planning Commission of November 28, 2023 to order. And we'll start with roll call.
Thank you. Chair, Commissioner Ottinger? Here. Commissioner Burns is absent. Commissioner Hanley? And this will be a mic check too. I think you were muted.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
I'm here, yes, virtually.
Thank you. And because you're remote, we actually don't, we were just discussing, we don't have any items other than minutes for a quorum. So we don't need to go through the AB 1334 language for you for your remote participation.
Great.
Vice Chair Fritz?
Here.
And Chair Fernandez?
Here.
Thank you. And we do have a quorum.
Okay. Next item, comments from the public on items that are not on tonight's agenda. Don't see anyone either virtually or in real. So.
And we have not received any items recently in the planning department for items either.
Okay. Great. So move on to item number 3. Don't have anything to consider, so no statements, conflict of interest. And moves on to item 4, approval of minutes. Does anyone have any changes or additions to the minutes?
I move we approve the minutes of June 13th, 2023.
I will second that. And if there's no further discussion or changes, I'll call for the vote.
Sure. Commissioner Ottinger?
Aye.
Commissioner Hanley?
Abstain.
Vice Chair Fritz?
Abstain.
And Chair Fernandez?
Aye.
Okay, so we do have a positive vote of 2 with 2 abstentions.
Okay, thank you. Okay, item number 5, public hearings. We don't have any, and it moves us to our regular agenda items. 6A, Planning Commissioner Training, video and discussion.
Thank you, and we will start off with the video in just a moment.
Understanding the processes and implementation of zoning will help you and your community. In this course, we'll touch on several aspects of zoning. For instance, we'll talk about the challenges associated with nonconformities. You'll also learn that the actions of the planning official can have consequences. This information will be invaluable in helping you base your zoning decisions on the comprehensive plan. Zoning deals with the use of land and influences how private property owners can use and enjoy their property. At the same time, zoning provides a valuable public service by balancing the interest of the private individual with that of the broader community. This course provides a valuable foundation for the other courses in the training, helping you to understand how zoning fits into the broader context of community development. Zoning divides the community into various districts. Each of those districts has its own set of standards that relate to the use and the construction taking place on that property. More and more communities are placing an emphasis on the built form of a constructed project, paying less attention or putting less emphasis on the use of that property, but instead placing most regulation on the placement of the building on the lot, on how the building interfaces with the public right-of-way, and helps to create a memorable public space, similar to what you might have experienced in a traditional downtown. Whether regulating the use of the property or more the form of the building, zoning also often will limit the height of structures and the intensity of development on the particular property. All 50 states have adopted zoning enabling legislation that is emphasizing the importance of land use as it relates to public health, safety, and welfare. Most states adopted their enabling legislation based on the federal Standard State Zoning Enabling Act. This is a document that was produced by the Department of Commerce in 1922 and shared widely throughout all 50 states. The intent of the Standard State Zoning Enabling Act was to make it clear to states that they had the authority through their own state constitutions to enable municipal governments to adopt zoning ordinances in the interest of health, safety, and welfare. Over time, those enabling statutes in each of the states has changed, and zoning authority for local governments does vary somewhat from state to state. One of the Zoning Enabling Act's most significant provisions was that zoning shall be based on a comprehensive plan, also referred to as a master plan in some states. Since the zoning ordinance should be based on the master plan, the intent of the master plan is to communicate the policy for the overall community as it relates to land use and future development of the community. This plan is based on a combination of science, facts, and opinion, and is the community's overall public policy for the future of the community. Generally, zoning is set up so that no one body or official has absolute power. Remember when you learned about the separation of power of the federal government into the legislative, executive, and the judicial branch? The same division of power exists with local governments through the zoning ordinance. These concepts were introduced in Course 7, Constitutional Limits of Planning and Zoning. Here's a statement from author Richard Babcock introducing this concept of balancing powers between different branches of local government. One division or branch of local government is the legislative body. This would be the city council or the township board. One of the authorities of the legislative body is to adopt the zoning ordinance and to perform subsequent amendments to the zoning ordinance. Amendments include both changes to the text of the zoning ordinance and also changes to the zoning map, referred to as rezoning actions, where we move the zoning from one district on a property to a different district. While the Planning Commission may assist with recommending amendments to the zoning ordinance, the Planning Commission is not the legislative body with that final authority of adoption. The legislative body in some states also has the authority to adopt the comprehensive or the master plan. Legislative duty also includes the adoption of the budget for the Planning and Zoning Department, plus the appointment of members to the Planning Commission or the quasi-judicial board, the Zoning Board of Appeals. Importantly, the legislative body is also responsible for implementing key portions of the master plan. For instance, investments proposed within the capital improvements program. Another division of local government power is that reserved for the administrative officials. We're talking about the zoning administrator, but also the planning commission. Both the zoning administrator and the planning commission perform important roles of administering the zoning ordinance on a day-to-day. Things like site plan review, reviewing special land use permits, holding public hearings on amendments to the zoning ordinance. Importantly, the zoning ordinance must state which local body or official is responsible for these zoning decisions. While legislative officials may act in an administrative capacity, they must be sure that when they are making those decisions, they're basing their decisions on the standards in the ordinance and the standards alone. Third, we have the quasi-judicial branch of local government. This is also known as the Zoning Board of Appeals. The Zoning Board of Appeals has important responsibilities that include hearing requests for variances, interpreting different provisions of the zoning ordinance, making decisions related to nonconformities, and perhaps other duties assigned to the ZBA in your community. Not all ZBAs have the same authority. For instance, some zoning board of appeals are not able to grant use variances to property within the jurisdiction. The legislative body sets the powers of the ZBA to a certain extent, and in some cases, the legislative body itself can serve as the zoning board of appeals. Here's a knowledge question for you. Can a community skip some of the procedural steps in the Zoning Enabling Act in order to make the process more streamlined? The answer, of course, is no. The process set up in the Zoning Enabling Act and in the individual community zoning ordinance is there in order to provide due process of law for everyone involved in the zoning process. Skipping a procedural step is a very good way to hand your opposition a winning case if challenged in court. Why do this when it takes only a few extra steps to complete the process the way it's supposed to be done? Here's a planning and zoning tip from a longtime planning and zoning consultant, author, and professor, Mark Wyckoff. Pause the video and read Mark's quote. Course 2 covered powers of local government. Let's talk now about some of the limitations on local government power. While the authority to zone is quite broad, there are limitations on local government's power, and that's designed to balance the interests of the private individual with that of the public as a whole. As a review of Course 7, we learned about constitutional protections related to the government power. We talked about substantive due process and procedural due process. Substantive due process has to do with the purpose of the regulation. It ensures that government regulation is based on a reasonable public interest. Procedural due process, on the other hand, helps to make sure that there is a standard process that is fair to all individuals involved in the planning and zoning process. It also ensures that there are decision makers who are free from bias and conflict of interest. Another constitutional limitation is that of equal protection. Local government decisions and actions must not treat individuals differently based on their background. These are things like protection related to race, gender, religious beliefs, etc. Takings are also an important consideration of government. The Constitution says that government must not take private property without just compensation. In some cases, local regulations can go too far, according to the courts, and amount to a taking of private property. There's also First Amendment rights. Local zoning cannot interfere with free speech, expression, or the exercise of religion. Let's talk about a few more legal concepts. There's a concept referred to as vested rights. Once a project has started, the rights for that project have vested, and local government cannot introduce new regulations that might change what was previously permitted for that development. Another concept is state preemption. On some topics, the state has adopted legislation that essentially occupies the field for regulation on that subject. An example of state preemption throughout the US that's often found is that of right to farm laws. Lastly, we must remember that local authority, for the most part, is granted to local governments from the state. So local governments must not go beyond that which is authorized in their enabling legislation. Beyond these legal limitations, zoning is also constrained by private contractual obligations. An example would be restrictive covenants in a subdivision. I'll share an example of a subdivision that was developed largely as a residential project. The deeds of each of the lots in that subdivision stated that the properties could only be used for residential purposes. At some later date, the developer, who had some undeveloped lots, sought to rezone those to a commercial use. After all, those lots did front on a commercial street. The Planning Commission in this case upheld the rezoning or granted the rezoning, but property owners in the subdivision challenged that decision. Ultimately, the court overturned the Planning Commission decision, stating that the private contractual agreement between the purchasers of the property and the developer required that the use of the property remain residential. So while zoning is far-reaching, there are important limits on the authority that limits on power. While zoning is far-reaching, there are important limits on power of local government with respect to zoning. We'll see in Chapter 4. Welcome to Chapter 4. Now let's talk about the connection between the zoning ordinance and the comprehensive plan. As we stated earlier, most state zoning enabling acts require that zoning be based on a comprehensive plan intended to support the health, safety, and welfare of the community. Zoning, obviously, is one of the key ways that the master plan or the comprehensive plan is implemented. As we discussed in Course 3, the comprehensive plan helps to communicate the important values of the community. It sets an official public policy statement for how the community would like to grow, change, or develop for the future. It identifies the current needs of the community and describes how, through land use change, those needs will be addressed. Therefore, in many ways, zoning is based on the same facts, science, and opinion as the master plan. Of course, it's different in that zoning includes the technical regulatory content that's based on the state statute, court cases, and other interpretations made by the Zoning Board of Appeals over time. It should now be clear why a community might choose to adopt zoning. And you might have also gathered that zoning is optional. Most state enabling laws do not require communities to adopt zoning. However, if they do want to regulate land use, they need to adopt a comprehensive zoning ordinance. Disgruntled property owners in your community might ask, why is zoning necessary? Well, importantly, zoning helps to protect property values by setting minimum standards of use of the property. In that way, zoning helps to prevent incompatible land uses from existing within a close proximity of one another. Zoning also includes natural resource protection steps or measures. These would be things that help to minimize the impact of development on a given site that has important natural features. We're talking about things like natural feature setbacks, buffers, and protection of sensitive natural environments. Zoning can also help prevent nuisances by establishing setbacks or requiring buffers between different uses of land. Zoning is also intended to prevent overcrowding by establishing setbacks, limiting the intensity of development on a site, also limiting the height of a particular development project. Zoning also helps to limit impacts on infrastructure by addressing congestion and development over time throughout the community. Let's explore a little farther with a knowledge question. How does zoning limit the intensity of land use? Well, zoning regulates land use intensity in the form of minimum lot sizes, by establishing setbacks, by having a height limitation on buildings in the district. There might be also standards that set the maximum impervious surface allowed on a given development site, or the requirement of naturally vegetated buffers between development sites. These standards serve to limit the extent of development allowed on a given site. We've talked about the purposes and reasons for zoning. Now let's talk about who creates the zoning ordinance. While professional planning assistance is important for creating a comprehensive plan, it's almost essential for developing a zoning ordinance. Whether it's a professional planner that's staffed by the community or it's a planning consultant, these are professionals that have the background and training to know how to develop a zoning ordinance. On the other hand, some communities have enough volunteers that the Planning Commission might be able to take on the development of a zoning ordinance over time themselves. However, it will be very important in this instance that the community consult with an attorney who's very experienced with land use law before adoption of that zoning ordinance. Ultimately, the zoning ordinance is not the Planning Commission's or the planning consultant's, it's the community's zoning ordinance. It must reflect the community's values and beliefs while also being rooted in law. Therefore, it's important that communities don't copy and paste zoning provisions from another community, or if they do, they take careful steps to review that provision and make sure that it's tailored appropriately for their own community. Whether hiring a consultant, preparing a zoning amendment on your own, or borrowing provisions from another community, it's absolutely essential because zoning is a legal document that the municipal attorney is involved before the document is adopted. Planning is a professional service. So if you're hiring an individual, it's important that you hire someone that has a college degree in planning or a related field such as public administration. There are also voluntary certifications that planners can achieve. For instance, the American Planning Association's American Institute of Certified Planners credential. In some states, they actually do professionally licensed planners. New Jersey would be one example. A professional planner must also uphold a professional standard of behavior, following both a code of ethics and also best practices in the field. Naturally, a professional planner engages in planning services like preparation of a draft document, but even before that draft plan, we're talking about planning steps like engaging the community around a particular subject area, doing some of the data and background analysis that's important for basing that public opinion. A professional planner naturally provides planning services. Those include things like doing the background studies in order to develop the data or factual basis of a master plan. Planning also includes engagement of community members to develop a level of support and consensus around the master plan. Other important steps include tasks related to general municipal services. That could be administering the zoning ordinance for a community. It could also include issuing permits as individuals come in order to make use of their property in new and different ways. Therefore, a planner would also perform zoning administration functions in the community. Tasks like site plan review, reviewing special land use permits, and issuing other correspondence related to the Planning Commission function. Also, the planner might also engage in public outreach and interface with the media on various topics and interests of the community. I've mentioned why it might be important for a community to hire a professional planner. Let's talk quickly about a topic known as qualifications-based selection. Most individuals are familiar with the bidding process, where we might look for the lowest bidder to provide a particular service or to purchase goods as a municipality. While bidding as a selection process works good when purchasing a tangible product, it's not the best way to contract for a professional service. Instead, consider using qualifications-based selection, or QBS. The basis of QBS is finding the planning consultant that's most qualified to perform the role. The thinking goes something like this. The experienced planner can get the job done properly in the right amount of time based on the budget, while hiring someone who might be a low bidder on an hourly basis. That individual might require more time to do background research and preparation for the task at hand. In the end, that low bidder might end up costing the community more money for a product that is of less quality. While we're talking about planning staff, how about this knowledge question? Can the community planner also serve as the zoning administrator? Of course, the answer is yes. In many communities, this is how it's done. Now, depending on the staff capacity and the budget that's available, it may be wise to hire both a planner and a zoning administrator to separate those functions to some degree. Here in Chapter 6, we'll cover more specifics about the zoning ordinance. In addition to the standards and regulations found in the text of the zoning ordinance, it's important to know that there is also something called the zoning map, which specifies the districts across the community where zoning regulations apply. While referred to differently, the zoning text and the zoning map are not separate documents, but are instead different parts of a single document for the community. Because zoning is often a lengthy document, it's divided into chapters or articles that serve to group similar provisions. Thought should be given to the codification system used by the community. This is the system for numbering or lettering the different provisions of the zoning ordinance. It's wise to think of a system that makes sense for you as a community, but also that the public will be able to make use of when finding provisions in the ordinance. There are many conventions for how zoning ordinances are organized. This means that most zoning ordinances are organized in a similar way, yet there are important distinctions from one community to another. Out of necessity, zoning ordinances are often long and complex documents, but there are also some steps we can take in order to make these less daunting for reviewing. For instance, these days, it's important that zoning ordinances be located online and include hyperlinks for moving from one article or section of the ordinance to another with greater ease. The use of graphics in an ordinance is also important for helping to understand what some of the provisions might mean. In addition to the issues important to the community, the zoning ordinance will also include directives that come from the state or that have been passed down through case law in that particular state. If the ordinance is casually written or written without professional guidance, there's an increasing chance that there are loopholes in the ordinance that could be exploited. Those loopholes will leave the community at greater risk if challenged in court. While the text should leave little room for interpretation, it should also be written in a way that is easy for the public to use and understand. Precise language in zoning is important. One of the most frequent language slips in zoning is failing to distinguish between yard and setback. Using these terms interchangeably can result in some unintended outcomes. For example, an ordinance might state that no parking can exist in the front yard of a particular development site. Now, let's imagine a substantial commercial building that's set back some 500 feet from the property line. The no front yard parking requirement would mean that no cars are allowed between the front of the building and the street. The true intent was probably to prohibit parking within the front setback instead of within the front yard. If the actual setback in the district was 50 feet, no parking in the front yard setback would mean no cars are allowed within the first 50 feet from the street towards the face of the building. You can see that use of these two words differently result in very different outcomes on the land. You might be wondering, is there one way that a zoning ordinance must be organized? No, every ordinance is organized in a different way. There'll be reasons at the local level as to why certain provisions are included in one community or not in another. These days, though, All zoning ordinances should be placed online for ease of use by the public. In the next chapter, we'll learn more about the zoning map. Here in Chapter 7, we're going to talk a bit more about the zoning map. The zoning map is a visual depiction of the districts described in the zoning ordinance. Since the assignment of zoning districts has the potential to impact property values and traffic and congestion, great care must be taken in the placement of different districts throughout the community. This is to ensure that the zoning map reflects the desired future development of the community as articulated in the comprehensive plan. For an example, an area intended in the comprehensive plan to be residential should be zoned into one or more residential districts in the zoning map. Because the zoning map is part of the zoning ordinance, any change to the zoning map in the form of a rezoning is actually considered an amendment to the zoning ordinance. The zoning map is important because it visually depicts where certain uses, buildings, and activities can take place throughout the community. Each community decides what zoning districts will be named and the uses and regulations that will go along with those zoning districts. Therefore, it's important to examine the zoning text in addition to the zoning map in order to determine what is allowed within a given site. In one community, R1 might denote where large lot residential uses are allowed, whereas R4 might be a label given to multifamily housing development. Again, do not be misled by the zoning district name. Be sure to look at the zoning ordinance text in order to understand what is allowed in a particular zoning district. Just like the zoning ordinance text, there is one official copy of the zoning map. Oftentimes, this official copy is kept within the local government clerk's office. There should be a place on the zoning map for the clerk's signature and also space to note amendments that have taken place over time. The official zoning map is kept on file with the zoning ordinance in the government office. That doesn't mean there won't be copies of both documents that exist. Importantly, the zoning ordinance and the zoning map should be kept online. Here's another knowledge question. Is any copy of the zoning map considered an official copy? No, there's only one official copy of the zoning map, though there may be other copies that exist. These copies might be displayed in the local government office, online, or in other municipal offices. However, these are only copies and they're only accurate to the date that the copy was produced. The official zoning map exists within the local government office. In Chapter 8, I'll be talking about keeping the zoning ordinance current. No matter how much care was taken in drafting the ordinance the first time, changes in state law, changes in case law, new economic opportunities, and new technologies will all necessitate that from time to time the zoning ordinance needs to be amended and updated. Therefore, the zoning ordinance remains a work in progress. Therefore, it's important to constantly monitor the zoning ordinance for important updates, corrections, and improvements. In short, keeping the ordinance updated is a constant or continuous task. Keeping the ordinance up to date means knowing about changes in state law, new court cases, and new and emerging technologies and events. This means it's also important to keep yourself up to date. Consider subscribing to important trade publications, such as the American Planning Association's monthly planning magazine. You also might have state-specific planning and zoning publications, such as Planning Commissioner's Journal out of Vermont or Planning and Zoning News out of the state of Michigan. Join your state's professional planning association and monitor important case law coming out of the Court of Appeals, State Supreme Court, and U.S. Supreme Court. Attend regular training sessions and monitor what other communities within your region are doing. It's important for all members of the Planning Commission, the Zoning Board of Appeals, and staff to stay up to date on the latest events and trends. Some states have adopted requirements that mandate planning commissioners to engage in training before being reappointed to the Planning Commission for a second time. Importantly, this training expectation should be higher for the zoning administrator or the planner in your community. No matter how much care is taken in writing your zoning ordinance, perfection is never achieved. So as I said, it's important to constantly monitor the zoning ordinance for important updates, improvements, and corrections. Even if a zoning ordinance could be perfected at a given point in time, there will always be new case law new legislation coming from the state, new changes in technology, and emerging land uses that will require the zoning ordinance to be continually monitored and improved upon. And that's one of the main responsibilities of the Planning Commission, to monitor the zoning ordinance for needed improvements. One rule of thumb is that a zoning ordinance might need to be updated every 2 to 3 years, although updating it more often may be appropriate. It is useful for the zoning administrator to keep a running list of needed improvements to the zoning ordinance. Another technique is to monitor the Zoning Board of Appeals agenda. If there are similar requests that are frequently coming before the Zoning Board of Appeals, that might suggest that an amendment is needed to the zoning ordinance. For instance, if the Zoning Board of Appeals is issuing variances for similar things for different properties, this could be a reason to amend the zoning ordinance. However, there could be danger in being too quick to amend the zoning ordinance. There's a common reaction to want to amend the ordinance when a standard doesn't seem to work with a particular development proposal. The Planning Commission must distinguish between those events or requests that are one-time needs or those that appear to be more of a trend requiring the ordinance to be changed permanently. Remember, those one-time requests are to be left for the Zoning Board of Appeals to consider through the issuance of a variance. Here's a knowledge question for you. Why should the Planning Commission do an annual review of the types of requests that come before the Zoning Board of Appeals? Well, in reviewing the ZBA's actions, there may be a trend in the types of requests that are coming before the Zoning Board of Appeals. This may be a signal for the Planning Commission to review that portion of the zoning ordinance. Or this review could be done by the Zoning Board of Appeals at the request of the Planning Commission. Remember, the Planning Commission would be the body responsible for proposing an amendment to the zoning ordinance. Then that amendment would be considered by the legislative body. One principal reason for keeping up with changes in law is to make sure your actions are defensible if challenged in court. There are some reasonably simple practices to ensure that your decisions will be upheld if challenged in court. We're talking about risk management practices, some of which we've already discussed, such as following proper procedure, ensuring that decisions are carried out by the appropriate body, keeping accurate and detailed records, making zoning decisions based on standards, writing zoning ordinance provisions that have their basis in the comprehensive plan. All of this supports our focus of Chapter 8, keeping the zoning ordinance up to date. One of the most confusing and challenging aspects of zoning is dealing with nonconformities, those uses, lots, and buildings that were legally established, but now no longer conform to the standards of the zoning ordinance. Nonconformities occur because of action of local government, such as amending the zoning ordinance to change regulations. Also, there's a clear difference between a nonconformity and something that just doesn't conform to the standards of the zoning ordinance. A nonconforming lot, building, or use has gained the status of being legal because it was established at a time when the ordinance allowed it to be established. Something that does not conform to the ordinance and never did, that's considered to be a violation of the zoning ordinance, and enforcement should be taken. Think of it this way: government creates nonconformities, individuals create violations. In other words, an individual property owner cannot create a nonconformity. Each of the 3 types of nonconformities, lots, buildings, and uses, have rules for how they shall be handled specified in the zoning ordinance. A specific property may have several nonconformities, maybe a nonconforming use in a nonconforming building. The important thing is to treat each nonconformity separately. Ultimately, the goal of the community is to make each and every property conform to the standards of the zoning ordinance. So let's talk about some strategies for eliminating nonconformities. The surest way to eliminate a nonconformity is to purchase that property from a private individual or entity. Essentially here, local government is condemning the property and paying fair market value for it. Naturally, this can be quite expensive if there are a number of nonconformities throughout the jurisdiction. One way a property owner might eliminate a nonconformity is by applying for a variance from the Zoning Board of Appeals. In that case, if granted, the property would now be conforming. However, many ordinances state that the presence of a nonconformity is not reason in and of itself for granting a variance. In any case, the application would have to meet the standards in the zoning ordinance for lawfully granting a variance. Building on the last slide, here's a knowledge question. If a variance is approved that allows a building to be built closer to a property line than allowed by the ordinance, is that building considered to be non-conforming? No. In this case, the building would be conforming by the issuance of the variance. In other words, by issuance of the variance, the Zoning Board of Appeals has said that this property now conforms to the zoning ordinance. We're now going to take each type of nonconformity in turn. We'll start with talking about nonconforming buildings. A nonconforming building is a building or a portion of a building that was legally established at one point in time. Now, because of a change in setback, in maximum building height, or some other regulatory standard, that building no longer conforms to the standards of the ordinance. Nonconforming status for buildings is created in one of two ways: when new districts are established or when a rezoning occurs. In either case, individual district regulations, such as setbacks, such as building height, such as maximum lot coverage, those will change, and chances are the building no longer conforms to the standards of the new district. Although less frequent, other actions taken by government to create nonconforming buildings includes things such as the expansion of a street or a road, basically expanding the right-of-way and occupying a portion of that private property. Although less common, another way nonconforming buildings are established is when a government might purchase additional right-of-way to expand the width of a street or a road. Whenever the ordinance is being considered for amendment, the community should consider the extent to which new nonconformities will be established. If the number of new nonconformities is rather large, perhaps some tweaks to that zoning amendment should be made in order to reduce the number of nonconformities being created. The main issues related to nonconforming buildings relates to the expansion or enlargement of those structures. Also, if those structures are damaged, will they be allowed to be rebuilt? Whether to allow expansions or enlargements of nonconforming buildings is something the community needs to consider. In some communities, for instance, it may be okay that a building that no longer conforms with the front yard setback is allowed to be expanded in the rear of the building. This may be permissible so long as the rear setback is satisfied. There may be other provisions that limit the expansion of a nonconforming building. For instance, some ordinances limit the expansion of a nonconforming building to 50% of its existing size. Another consideration for a nonconforming building is to decide whether or not a building will be allowed to be extended along a parallel line to that portion of the building which doesn't conform to the ordinance. For instance, a structure that is currently built into the side yard setback that is coming before the ZBA for an expansion, it might be allowed to be expanded so long as that new portion of the building does not encroach any further into the setback than the portion of the building does already. Another optional and more unique provision would be to allow a nonconforming building to be extended along the line of the existing nonconformity. For example, if a building already extends into the required side yard setback, a community might allow the building to be further extended so long as it does not encroach any further into that required side yard setback. Importantly, the zoning ordinance should address nonconforming buildings destroyed by acts of God. We're talking about fires, floods, other natural disasters. Most ordinances will allow a nonconforming building destroyed by fire or flooding to be rebuilt, so long as the replacement costs don't exceed a specified value defined in the zoning ordinance. A lower established value, such as 50% of the value of the structure, will limit the extent to which nonconforming buildings can be rebuilt, whereas a higher percentage will signal that nonconforming buildings generally are allowed to be rebuilt if damaged by acts of God. Let's now talk about nonconforming uses. A nonconforming use is a use of a building or a lot that was legally established, but now the zoning ordinance has been amended and the use no longer conforms to the use regulations of that district. That is when the zoning map is changed, moving that property from one district to another. Another situation that might create a nonconforming use is when the text of the zoning ordinance is changed, thereby changing the allowable uses specified as permitted uses in that district. Issues related to nonconforming uses include requests to expand or enlarge the use of a particular property. Another challenge is determining when a nonconforming use has been abandoned. In most states, there is a prohibition on the expansion of a nonconforming use. The rationale is that as a nonconforming use, the use of that property is no longer consistent with the vision articulated in the comprehensive plan. Keep in mind, though, not all nonconforming uses are unwanted because they're inconsistent with the zoning ordinance. As more communities think about creating walkable neighborhoods, what was once a nonconforming commercial use of a property might now be quite attractive for that community. Taking this into account, many communities establish different classes of nonconforming uses. One class might allow for more expansion of that nonconforming use because it doesn't have the types of uses or activities that have spillovers on neighboring properties. Another class of use, because of nuisance, dust, sights, smells, etc., might be considered a type of nonconforming use that we don't want to allow to be expanded. Some states, like Michigan and Utah, have great flexibility in how local government can address nonconforming uses. In Utah, state law specifies that a nonconforming use can take place so long as that use does not expand beyond the existing built structure. Like other aspects of zoning, with nonconforming uses, it's important to consult your state zoning enabling act. Unless a nonconforming use is purchased by the community, it can only be discontinued by an action of the property owner. This law of abandonment of nonconforming uses varies from state to state. Some states, like Michigan, require that there is intent on the part of the property owner to abolish the nonconforming use. This will require the zoning administrator to keep detailed records of action taken by the property owner in discontinuing a nonconforming use. Other states, like New York, allow local governments to set a discrete period of time for discontinuance of that nonconforming use. If the property owner is no longer engaging in that nonconforming use for that specified period of time, local government can establish that that nonconforming use has been abolished. Again, with issues related to expansions and enlargements of nonconforming uses, it is important to consult your state's Zoning Enabling Act and case law applicable to your state. Finally, we have nonconforming lots. A nonconforming lot is a lot that was legally established, but now, because of an amendment to the zoning ordinance and the district regulations, perhaps minimum lot size, minimum lot width, that lot no longer conforms to those district standards. As with other nonconformities, nonconforming lots may be established when government takes action to amend the district minimum regulations. In other cases, there may be government action such as expansion of a street or roadway that creates a nonconforming lot. Nonconforming lots must allow a use that is permitted within the district of the zoning ordinance. In other words, attempts to prohibit the use of a lot that is not large enough according to the zoning ordinance won't be upheld by the court. As is the case with other types of nonconformities, rules may be established to deal with nonconforming lots. For example, many ordinances require that when two nonconforming lots that are adjoining come under common ownership, those lots are now considered a single conforming parcel, and one of those lots can no longer be separated and sold. This type of regulation is referred to as a merger regulation and has been upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court in the case of Murr versus Wisconsin. In communities that have relatively few nonconforming lots, variance requests can be used to handle most situations. However, if a community has many nonconforming lots, they might consider amending the zoning district regulations in order to allow more of those lots to come into. However, if a community has many nonconforming lots, the community might consider amending the zoning ordinance in order to allow more of those lots to be conforming with the current district standards. In Chapter 10, we'll cover zoning administration. The zoning administrator is that local official who's responsible for taking applications from property owners, issuing permits, and performing other zoning enforcement actions. The zoning administrator is often the first person that a property owner will meet when considering a project for their property. As such, the zoning administrator must have great firsthand working knowledge of the zoning ordinance. In other words, the zoning administrator must be capable of giving accurate answers to questions that property owners might have. Some of the roles that a zoning administrator carries out is assisting with permits. The zoning administrator can provide invaluable assistance to property owners in helping them understand the meaning of certain terms and the regulations that apply to their property. That said, the zoning administrator must be sure that their personal opinions and biases don't come into the conversation with the property owner. Importantly, the zoning administrator needs both a customer service mindset, but also a mindset of upholding the zoning ordinance. They need to be open and forthright, but also able to cite important regulations in the ordinance that might apply. The other major role for the zoning administrator is assisting decision makers in the zoning process. The zoning administrator can provide information in several key ways. One of those is providing information in a timely fashion for making zoning decisions. Another way the zoning administrator is a broker of information is fielding requests from planning commissioners. It wouldn't be appropriate for a planning commissioner to speak to the applicant for a given project. However, the zoning administrator can ask the question and then relay the information to all planning commissioners so everyone is working from the same base level of knowledge. In some communities, the zoning administrator is even asked to provide recommendations to the planning commission when considering an application. Finally, there's the zoning administrator's key role of zoning enforcement. An effective zoning enforcement official is essential for achieving a community's land use goals. A community should only adopt provisions that they're willing to enforce. And that's the zoning administrator's role. Through enforcement actions, we see conformance with the zoning ordinance. And the zoning ordinance being based on the comprehensive plan, those actions ultimately result in implementation of the comprehensive plan. So the enforcement philosophy of the community is very important. We often talk about enforcement policy being something that requires a good COP: commitment, ordinance, and process. Commitment means having a budget to help with enforcement. It means having access to legal counsel, and it means having a legislative body that is committed to ordinance enforcement. The O we're talking about here is an ordinance that is written in a legally defensible manner and is consistently enforced throughout the jurisdiction. That ordinance is also one that's based on a plan, giving it the legal background it needs to be upheld in court. And finally, we have a process. We have a process that follows due process. That means a fair process that's consistently followed each and every time we have an enforcement issue at hand. There's no doubt being a zoning administrator is a difficult but very important job. Chapter 11 focuses on conditions on approvals. Most states allow administrative land use bodies to condition their approvals in order to harmonize the proposed use with existing surrounding properties. The local agency uses this conditional authority in order to balance the interests of the private developer with the broader community. A condition might be used to offset an otherwise adverse impact that might spill over on a neighboring property. In most states, conditions can be used when local boards approve subdivisions, approve special land uses, review site plans, and issue variances. All of these types of decisions involve discretionary standards by which the Planning Commission or the Zoning Board of Appeals must apply a discretionary standard to the case at hand. In these instances, it may be appropriate to apply a condition to an approval. Once a condition is imposed, it must be complied with before a building permit is issued. Or if it's a condition that applies during the construction process, that condition will need to be complied with before issuance of an occupancy permit. When attaching conditions to an approval, that condition must be rationally related to the impact that is sought to be mitigated. It also must be proportional to the extent of that impact. In Michigan, this rational relationship is established in the Zoning Enabling Act, where it requires that natural resources be protected, where traffic and safety is considered, and that communities ensure compatibility with adjacent land uses. The types of conditions that have been upheld by courts in certain circumstances include fences and other buffers, access roads, soil erosion prevention, drainage facilities, outdoor lighting, restrictive covenants that prevent development in a floodplain, and a variety of measures that help to eliminate odors, dust, etc. In Chapter 11, we address standards of review. That is the review of your decisions by a court. As a planning official, you may wonder how your decisions are evaluated by a court of law. Fortunately, courts are generally very deferential to the decisions made by a planning commission or a zoning board of appeals. That means the court will often defer to the wisdom of the planning commission or the ZBA. However, when courts do review decisions made by administrative land use bodies, they're looking for facts on the record related to the standards that are applied in the case. Those facts help to establish a reasonable basis for the decision that is being made. Under these standards of review, it doesn't matter that the court might have decided the case differently. What matters is that the Planning Commission or the ZBA base their decisions on real facts in the case at hand. That said, sometimes the court does reverse the decision of a land use administrative body. One common basis for reversal of a local decision is when conditions have been applied in a severe way just because of neighborhood opposition to a proposed project. The court needs to see facts in the case that provide a reasonable basis for the decision. While the deferential standard by the courts on local decisions is generally the same throughout the state, the amount of evidence on the record to support that decision does vary. Some states, for instance, require that there is substantial evidence to support a decision, where other states merely require facts in the record. Consulting your municipal attorney will help you understand the degree to which facts must be included in your record. Let's hope your board stays out of court in the first place, but one day when one of your decisions is challenged, let's hope that the lessons that you've learned following this course will help you prevail. Let's round out the course with a simple activity. Your job is to put these example elements from a zoning ordinance into a logical order that flows or makes sense to the casual reader. Pause the video now and review the elements on the screen, putting them into the order that you see fit. Well, I wonder what you came up with. Here's an example answer to this particular activity. You can see that most zoning ordinances
Would you like me to go back? Or just keep going? Okay.
are organized in a way where the title, the purpose, and definitions are at the beginning of the document. Often, general regulations and zoning district standards follow thereafter. And then we'll get into site development standards, site plan review, and special land uses. Often, a zoning ordinance concludes with a chapter on the Zoning Board of Appeals, followed by overall zoning administration. That said, there are many ways to organize a zoning ordinance, and on the screen, you can look at other possible and logical ways to organize the zoning ordinance in your community. So let's review. After watching this course, you now should be able to identify the background and purposes of zoning and how the zoning ordinance relates to the comprehensive plan. Describe the zoning ordinance and the zoning map. Talk about some of the day-to-day challenges of zoning, particularly as it relates to nonconformities. You also should be able to describe how to keep the zoning ordinance current and to help you stay out of court. This concludes Course 8 of Planning Commissioner Training. How does zoning work? Thanks for watching.
Okay. So welcome to my world. No, I don't know if there's just any questions. I think he spent a lot of time on nonconformity, which makes sense because how you deal with things that aren't consistent with your zoning ordinance end up being something that is one of the more tricky parts. I don't know if there are any other questions. Otherwise, if there are questions about the non-conforming, I know there's specific ways we deal with things here as well that I can talk about.
I just thought it was interesting how he talked about it, and in that, he talked about, well, you can, purchase the property and make it, and like, we have so many non-conforming properties in this town. It seems like that would be a heavy lift.
Yes.
It seems like that it's hard to, because, and it seems like especially for, that would be the case for older communities that were built before there was a zoning code. There's lots of originally property sizes and the way things were platted out that would never conform with a modern zoning code. That seems like that would really only apply to newer cities that were established after zoning codes really started,
Where they don't have a lot of
where
that.
they already,
yeah.
where there was like a zoning code, like Windsor wasn't this town until like the 1990 something, and they started with the zoning code that they could, so it's kind of interesting
Right.
to sort of think about the
Sebastopol's
differences.
zoning code didn't come in until a bit later than some communities I've worked in, where it's
Mhm.
been like 20 years previous, 1920s versus 1940, late 1940s.
Do you know when
um,
Sebastopol, do you know when we had our first zoning code?
I believe it was sometime in the 40s,
In
I
the
believe.
40s?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I have seen, like the last place I worked, there were certain elements at least that were much, much older than that. They were
Yeah.
more than 1920s or so.
Yeah.
The way our zoning ordinance deals with structures is fairly lenient. And I think that's, he talked about the different classes, like, is it noxious or not? He talked about it more in terms of uses. Like if you have something billowing smoke in the middle of a residential neighborhood, that's going to be a more important nonconformity than the corner store that's been there for ages. And in fact, you might actually want that these days. We might be returning to that. I think most of the residential nonconformities are, or the physical nonconformity, I will say residential because it's mostly on the residential side, because we don't have setbacks in our commercial zones in general, so it's not as huge a deal. We do have that allowance that he talked about, where if you have a nonconforming setback, at least on the sides or rears, you can actually continue it as long as it's one story and not over a certain height and not more than 20 feet or something like that. So we actually provide some flexibility in our zoning code, which I think kind of acknowledges that there are a lot of non-conforming properties. And how do you do in addition to that if you still need to make the building somehow contiguous so that it works as a building? We also have a provision that, and I know you've all seen it quite a bit, where you can continue or expand a non-conforming use or structure with a use permit. And so those are items that actually come to the Planning Commission. I know we had an ADU that was, I forget what it was, First Street or somewhere down on the south side of town, where it was basically a barn. And yeah, that was where to change the use from a garage or barn to a ADU, and it was closer than the 4 feet to the setback. That's a nonconformity because it was. And here's one of the big things: that was it created legally? And so that's one of the research we always do. Was there a building permit on file? I can, from looking at it as a building official, which we often use our building official. There are times you can tell something was not built legally and it was just kind of put up versus something that probably was without a permit, because we just can't find the permits. Usually the building department has at least the building permit record. Otherwise it's just illegal, right? And it doesn't have any rights to it. But in that case, it was pretty clear that it was a structure that was constructed legally. So then how do you do that? And we have that use permit, which is the same thing that we have for a non-conforming use, and that allows us to review things. And there are times because if we have uses that require use permit now but didn't get one when they started, if it changes owners, then it does need to come to the Planning Commission for a use permit. And part of that is making sure that it's still appropriate use. But the other component of it is, well, are there conditions of approval just for operations that make sense to make sure that are in place going forward to make sure it doesn't become a nuisance? And so, like, I know we had the big example I can think of, and I know both of you were on the commission at the time, was the Fircrest Convalescent Hospital on the south side of town. So that was originally created when a use permit was not required. It had sat vacant for more than 12 months, which is our time period for abandonment of a non-conforming use. And then we had Crestwood Mental Health want to come in and make it a mental health clinic. And so that required a use permit. And it would have either way, just by the fact that it didn't have a use permit to change hands even less than the 12 months. And that's always tricky. Like, is it something that requires a use permit or not? If it's not a specific category. And I know that's one where I had to work with the city attorney on. It was over the 12 months. So it sort of ended up being a really easy, yes, it needs a use permit. But that was, hey, let's make sure there's operating hours or, things like good neighbor policy, that type of thing. That you would typically do as a use permit approval condition. And non-conforming lots are probably they're probably the least noxious. Most people have in their code a provision that if it's an existing legally created lot, there's not really anything we do about it. And most of them aren't huge issues. There are communities that have very small slivers of lands that were created by random people before the Subdivision Map Act in the 70s, where it's just a completely it's landlocked, or it doesn't, and it has no access to any sort of road or utilities, or it's a sliver of land that's 10 feet wide and doesn't make any sense. Those communities have generally done some sort of forced merger for those lots if one of those slivers was vacant, basically, and it clearly was just not a viable lot, and that's why it was still vacant. So people have done that as a way of cleaning up. Sebastopol does not have very many of those. We have maybe a couple of lots that are very odd because they're formerly streets, but they're not necessarily buildable lots. They just happen to be private parcels. I know the Barlow has some weird lot lines, but they have cross easements to deal with all of that, and it just doesn't matter for them. So
Yeah, that one lot that I was looking at on Laguna Parkway, that was very
There you go.
weird. I think
Yeah.
there was a street at one point because there was all these like weird parcels that were all globbed together into this
Right.
funny shaped. Yeah.
Yeah, and there are a few in Sebastopol. Historically, some of those are related to where the railroad spurs came in
Mhm.
and how they cut up land.
Mhm.
And yeah, those are there are definitely a few of those odd ones in there.
Yeah. Is that a separate lot, that kind of narrow strip between the Barlow and the movie theater? That's a separate parcel, right?
It is a
And-
separate parcel. I don't know the exact history on it, other than I believe it was formerly part of Johnson Street that was
Mm.
abandoned
Mhm.
at some point and turned over to as a private parcel. And I don't know anything more about the history than that, other than that it is.
Yeah. I had heard
Um,
that the city actually did have it. It was the city's at one point. Maybe when Johnson Street, they abandoned Johnson Street, the city still owned the land. And then I think I heard that they sold it. I think the person who owns the movie theater.
Correct.
owns
So
it,
yeah,
right?
yeah, that's owned by the movie,
Yeah.
the same person who owns the movie theater. So that those parcels, and that's the kind of situation where you would, because it's not really a buildable lot,
Yeah.
where in that forced merger situation, that would end up having to be
Mhm.
done. The way we tend to deal with it now is, well, if there is any sort of lot line adjustment ever since the 1972, when the Subdivision Map Act was passed, that basically said private individuals can't just create new lots on their own. It has to be approved by the local jurisdiction, and it has to be in conformance with the Subdivision Map Act, which has certain recordation and survey requirements. But yeah, so anytime someone wants to do that, they need to come to the city. We look at it in terms of, are the two lots going to be non-conforming once a lot line adjustment is completed? So you can't take, if you're in an R6 zone where you have a 6,000 square foot lot size, you can't take two 6,000 square foot lots and give 1,000 square feet to the other one. The same with the lot width and the setbacks and all those types of things. There there are a few that we've done where it ends up being a more irregular line. Usually that's because someone has an existing encroachment of a structure, whether it's a retaining wall or a garage or something like that, that they realize is on their neighbor's parcel. We've also did one a year or so ago, where someone had an ADU that they were supposed to have built within certain setbacks. It turned out that property line was not where they thought it was, and they didn't have a survey, so they realized it was not non-conforming. It was just illegally done. So to resolve that, they actually worked with the neighbor to apply for a lot line adjustment so it would have the appropriate setbacks. So that's actually one way where most lot line adjustment ends up happening to make something, if not completely conforming with setbacks, but at least to get them to where it's all on the same parcel, or that it is conforming to the setbacks. But it is probably one of the more interesting, but also the more mind-numbing. Like, how do you deal with this? What's the best way to deal with this? Our code is fairly relaxed, and we don't have any industrial uses that are so noxious that the city would want to buy it to get rid of it as an issue. I know when redevelopment 20 years ago, when redevelopment was a thing, that was happening, but and then it became a little bit more of just wanting to redevelop to get a better tax base kind of thing.
Okay. A lot of stuff to discuss for future stuff, right? Okay, so if there's nothing else, we'll move on to, I don't think there's any subcommittee updates. Go planning director's report. Do you have anything?
Sure, just a couple of items. Upcoming meetings. We do have next Tuesday, the city council that's the first meeting in December, so they do their selection of their mayor and vice mayor. And then we also have the objective design standards on that agenda. And Vice Chair Fritz, I'm hoping you can put that on your calendar to attend remotely or in person, either way. I think that would be great. We will have Opticos there to do a general presentation as well and answer any questions. I did want to remind folks that we do have a couple of vacancies on the Planning Commission. If you are interested in reapplying for your seat, the deadline for that is December 4th, or if you know anyone else who might be interested in applying, that as well as the applications for the Design Review Board and the Climate Action Committee, all of which have term ending this December, have vacancies open. The Design Review Board, I believe, has a general member as well as one of the more structured, like contractor architect positions. So that's one thing to look at as well, if you know anyone who's just a general member of the public who might be interested in that. I did want to announce that we did release the request for proposals for the Caltrans Sustainable Transportation Grant today. It is now posted on our website. And Paul, I know I met with you and some others, and I did hear what you said about wanting it to be an open RFP. And so that has been posted as an open RFP. If anyone would like the link to that, that does include the final scope, which is pretty much what went to council with their authorization to accept the grant, with a few minor tweaks that Caltrans requested from us. But that is also part of that. In terms of projects, Jen and I are working away to get the public draft of the EIR, the Environmental Impact Report for the Canopy project. That's the City Ventures project of 80 units plus up to 16 ADUs on the north side of town. That should be released in the next couple of weeks. We have a couple of issues the applicant is addressing before that. The Habitat for Humanity building permit is almost ready to issue. And the Elderberry Commons building permit has been applied for and is in review. That's to convert the 30 I think there already was one of the 31 units, so 30 of the rooms to add kitchenettes to make them permanent supportive housing. And the Woodmark project is continuing construction. Their grading, major grading is getting close to being done for phase one. They've poured 2 of the foundation slabs for 2 of the 4 buildings, and they're working on the 3rd and 4th and hopefully wrap that up in the next couple of weeks, as well as the water line in transition to having the construction entry on the west side, which is their access through. So they don't share that access with the adjoining property owners. And it does look like the interviews for the Planning Commission DRB vacancies won't take place until mid-January. So for those of you whose terms are ending, which I believe is Chair Fernandez and Commissioner Hanley, I will be in contact with you, but I'm hoping that you would be willing to serve until such time as the City Council can hold interviews and appoint or reappoint. I know that's going to go past the December 31st term ending, but we'll contact you separately about that, but just a heads up about that.
And we'll
Thank
get
you.
extra pay for that, right?
Yes, double what you get. Double zero is what? And then it looks it looks like the Planning Commission work plan will also be going to the City Council in mid-December as well for discussion. And I do anticipate, just based on conversations that I've had with the council at some of the revenue discussions that they've had recently on City Council agendas, and then also just personally, that there may be a couple of items that they may want to discuss in terms of the things they may want us as the Planning Commission to look at in terms of the zoning ordinance, and keeping that up to date as as per the video we all just watched. And I think that is, Susie, did I miss anything? All right, great. That's it, unless you have any questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
I went to this meeting last week that was kind of strange. There's this group kind of associated with soft medicine,
Okay.
and they were talking about the hotel property and said Sebastopol hotel property downtown, and said that they had been in contact with the hotel property developer and the city council about buying the property and turning it into a park. Have you heard any conversation of this? Because that kind of disturbed me.
I have not. I have not. And I had a conversation with a council member just today, and that certainly was not a topic that came up.
Yeah.
I do know from, in terms of what's going on with that project, we have their lot merger of those 2 lots scheduled for the December 12th hearing, and that's a environmental review committee, which is sort of like the zoning administrator. It's a staff level committee, but it's which is interestingly in itself a potential change to the subdivision ordinance, because most cities do not make that stuff go through hearings because it's ministerial. But they have that's scheduled for December 12th. So that is, they just submitted that application a month ago to move their PG&E applications forward. So
Yeah, no, I thought it was strange, and they were saying a couple of things that they said, well, we've been talking with the developer, we've talked to some of the council members, and I thought, I've never heard this, and just some of the things they were sort of talking like it hadn't even been approved yet, and I was like, no, it's definitely been approved. So anyway, I'm just wondering if you'd heard any rumors to that effect, or
no, from my side, I've been working with the Hotel Sebastopol to keep them moving and encourage them, and and they've been. They've spent a lot of money on the entitlements and the planning process and the building permits, and they just submitted, one of their subsequent permits to us a month ago. So
Good. Glad to hear that. And then, have you heard anything from the Huntley Square people?
I did speak with Beth from them. I believe they will, even if they start their building. they're building sooner, they are going to likely be submitting for an extension of their tentative map, because their tentative map is a 2-year expiration, not 3-year like the other stuff is. So I am anticipating that would come before the Planning Commission for review.
Okay. Well, if there's nothing else, I will adjourn the meeting to the next meeting being held December 12th at 6 o'clock. And as I mentioned, I will be not here, and I can be available for if you need a quorum, if it's something urgent.
Okay.
Otherwise, I'll be out in the Caribbean. So
Excellent. Well, I do know that we will have the Little League here to do their annual report, and likely the Rotary folks, which will mostly be listening, but they are interested in helping with the Ives Park improvement stuff. So, yeah, those are at least 2 of the items. I would like to talk to you afterwards. We may end up wanting to schedule a special meeting for the Canopy EIR. Once we release it, it has a 45-day public review comment period, and we would typically have a public planning commission public hearing during that time for public comment on the draft EIR. I like to have that in the middle or a week and a half before the end of the comment period. That way people have had enough time to review the document and have sort of meaningful thoughts about it. You know, it's not day 2 of a 2-inch thick document. But also I don't like to have it on the last day, because people come to the meeting and then want to think about it. We want to allow for time for comment afterwards also. But with the holidays, it's a little bit like trying to make sure that project keeps on track, but also a good time for that hearing. But
okay, sounds good. All right, thank you, everyone.
Recording stopped.